I'm Silly Lamas, and today I'm going to read you a fictional story. A story that you might read to your children when you're a bit older. The Curse of the Flying Squirrel. The tale begins on a planet far, far away, ruled by one kingdom and inhabited by life forms very similar to humans. They all lived their lives blissfully. Most of them worked all day and couldn't wait until the clock hit 5 p.m. to drop their plows and head on home. Similar to our world, they also had a day like Friday, which most of them eagerly awaited, week after week. In fact, some may argue that this was their favorite day of the whole week. This was the evening where their masters had promised and granted them 2 full days of rest. This clearly was a celebration and enjoyment of their life choices. After 5 p.m., most of them used their whole free time sitting down and eating, since they needed to get some well-deserved rest to start their journey of fulfillment again the week after. Most of them even took some extra effort to educate themselves about kingdom-wide problems and events from their local news board. To do better and serve more, of course. Confidently knowing that everywhere around their neighboring lands had it worse, so they must be grateful and happy. And of course they were. Happily, day after day, their life continued until one day the kingdom was struck by a disaster. No one really knew what was going on. The messages from news were controversial, and first time ever everyone now understood that they had it worse than their neighboring lands. What was sure was that toilet paper, with very similar use than on our planet, somehow relieved the suffering. Many trading posts and merchants ran out of this precious commodity. Widespread panic tore through the whole kingdom. Finally, all the kings and queens assembled and announced to their people that the plague was upon them. A cursed flying squirrel, who had lived near a town which had a house of mages who created different curses and plagues, but isn't related to the story, had been hunted down and eaten. This was a bad no-no, because everyone in the kingdom knew that animals were precious, and to save the population they needed to cut back on eating meat and all those related products. After all, getting everyone fed had nothing to do with massive population growth, but everything to do with those bastards who dared to enjoy the taste of meat. But it was too late. The problem was that this squirrel had now cursed everyone. The plague ravaged land after land. Runny nose and cough out of this world struck down. Some lost their sense to enjoy the taste and smell of meat. And in worst cases, about 0.1% of population sadly perished or suffered permanent damage. Most of them in their young age of 80. The percentages were so high that kings and queens had to take immediate action, banning movements and freedoms, otherwise the plague would continue infecting. Everyone in their huts shivered and awaited better news, while looking out from their windows and saw playgrounds slowly being closed with barbed wire and fences. The situation seemed bleak. In the first week of this plague, a glimmer of hope emerged. Highly educated farmers around the world discovered a cure for this suffering. But kings and queens quickly removed this information from the public and informed everyone that a true cure is on their way. Peasants who dared to talk about this awful snake oil were ridiculed and socially hanged. Citizens of the kingdom now waited as their masters promised them cure. Slowly, as plague cases slowed down, everyone opened their doors and stepped out, but the world had changed. Everyone in public gatherings and markets had to wear a piece of their underwear in front of their faces, covering both mouths and noses. There were no exceptions, granting them whole 20% of protection if 2 meters of distance were kept. Most peasants had also started to change mentally. They didn't feel happy anymore. Their souls had taken more damage while sitting hidden from the plague than the illness could ever accomplish. Some farmers proudly wore their underwear around their face even when alone and even while driving their plows. This was a true dedication. After all, kings and queens knew what was best. But as everyone got together once again, it appeared that underwear around the face and washing hands wasn't enough. The curse had returned, and intervention was necessary. As all the towns in all the land slowly closed down again, The noblemen had finally prepared this long-awaited concoction of hope. The kingdom had to disregard all the rules of peasant safety. After all, this was what the citizens so desperately required: freedom. When granting licenses for merchants to sell their products across the land, especially where alchemy-related products were in question, it had to undergo at least 10 years of testing to see the long-term effects of those potions. Although the delivery method was tested about 10 years, the potion itself was no more than a few moons old. Kings and queens relieved themselves from any responsibility and made it purely as your own free choice to drink it. But if one didn't drink the potion, a hail of restrictions was put on them. They were ostracized, even though they had followed their own free will not to drink the potion. After all, they were free to choose, or so they thought. Many of them lost their long-loved occupations. Blacksmiths were cut from the labor force, even though weapons needed to be made. Candle makers were thrown on the streets, even when everyone needed light the most. Cooks were ridiculed and unhanded, even though there was hunger, all because they chose to choose. It seemed like some peasants understood that this was no actual choice. It was an illusion. Those were thrown under the wheels of noblemen's carriages. They were labeled as anti-potioners. Another word that was fed to farmers many ages ago, confused and mixed up with conspiracy. It seemed easy and convenient to blend all their views into one, but only pointing out the most radical ones to public, so the whole movement would seem ridiculous. No one seemed to understand that they had lost their freedoms long ago. They truly didn't have any choice, nor did they have any understanding of the bigger picture. They seemed to have forgotten history and mixed up rules, laws, rights and freedoms, or lack thereof. They seemed to have fallen victim to the system, not realizing that they were now fighting against other fellow farmers. Some went as far as calling anti-potioners killers and demanded more restrictions to them. Some lands and their rulers followed and tried to make drinking potions mandatory, disregarding every rule and code about personal freedoms and health choices. Some demanded that peasants who used their choice to choose should be denied treatment. Meanwhile, driving plows, which killed 1.2 million peasants a year, remained active on the fields. Smoking peace pipes that killed about 450 million peasants a year also remained. Drinking delicious meat also had very little restrictions. And obese farmers with more health risks than anyone else still received treatment, no exceptions. Most peasants had sadly fallen into depression, a disease only curable with most cutting-edge alchemy. Changing any habits and lifestyle clearly was never an option. All the peasants seemed to eat each other, calling each other out, spreading ignorance, false information, and denied facts available to them right from the beginning. It seemed that the local news board was the only place they knew and were accustomed to. Some lands started revolutions against the noblemen, but those news were quickly silenced. Posting any information about the failures and side effects of these potions were quickly torn down and labeled as misinformation and conspiracy. Peasants who died after drinking were quickly claimed to have some other health issues. Even though the citizens who had had their potion and yelled about their survival and no side effects didn't realize that there were many who were silenced, many who didn't have the power or resources to get through this kingdom-wide ban. Those who chose to choose were promised immunity and protection. They had risked their lives, they had risked their health for the greater good. They felt empowered to encourage others, not knowing what would happen in 10 years. It seemed to be a great sacrifice, but all the promises those kings and queens had given started to fall one by one. There was no immunity, there was no protection. Long lost was the ancient knowledge that smart don't rush. Many peasants lost their friends, not because of the plague, but to different views and understandings. It seemed that even religion had a way to coincide with different beliefs, but this curse of this flying squirrel was stronger. The plague had to live its course until everyone had achieved unity. This was the ultimate test. And everyone failed. Slowly, even kings and queens accepted everything that was clear right from the start. They had filled their bags with gold as everyone else were fighting. They could now finally give back some of the freedoms and seem like heroes, making it seem that they were right there right from the start to guide the herd to its rightful path. Although this never will be forgotten, everyone still chose to forget, all too oblivious what had really happened, and they all lived happily ever after. The end. I don't know about you, but if anything, this was a tale of caution, and we can be hopeful that this will never happen on our planet. On our planet we also have a saying, it's easier to fool people than convince them that they have been fooled. Good night, everyone.